Hello everyone, today we talk about the Longobard infantrymen from roughly the beginning of Longobard history to the Carolingian conquest. So it's a very broad timeline, but nevertheless the equipment of the Longobard warrior remains in the essentials really the same. Also the division between cavalry and infantry in here is not really it's not really useful conceptually, because the Longobard warrior could essentially fight in both ways, but still this is a good chance to concentrate maybe just of the tactical role of infantry as such, and looking at how even the same versatility of the Germanic warriors at those times was, perfectly compatible, in fact, with both options, really combat both fighting both on foot and on horseback. And in fact, we can open discussing a first element that is kind of interesting, even though we don't know excessively much, or we can't at least historically assess the reality for what it was. We can make conjectures that are kind of better or worse, but remain essentially such, as the Longobards are normally conceived essentially as a cavalry people, a horse riding people, especially in the face of the migration before settling definitely into Italy, when the people definitely sedentarized, and infantry probably definitely increased as a tactical element of the Longobard armies. Even though, as we've seen from a strictly technical point of view, there weren't really many changes in especially in the nature of the equipment. Why this point? Because really it's the old vexata question of how much these Germanic populations during the migration era had reached a level of mobility and semi-nomadism that essentially made them look somewhat closer to the full nomadic peoples of the steppes, or whether they remained actually more, let's say, closer to the original Germanic military tradition. This is an important point because the Longobards, seemingly in outlook from the facies, let's say, of their if you look at their equipment, especially, definitely looked like a horse riding people. I mean, they had a very strong connotation, as especially every freeman was ideally a cavalryman and fought on horseback, or at least that was the ideal. We know that ideals are very different from reality. There is no clear way to say how many Longobards, especially during the migration period, really fought on horseback on a regular basis. The problem stems essentially from the archaeological finds that before, especially the settlement in Pannonia, are, and more generally the one into Italy, are kind of the only sources at a point, aside from the scan historiographical evidence, for the history of the people as a whole. And these archaeological finds definitely show us that there was an elite, like in all the Germanic populations at the time, that used to fight on horseback, that also had their horses buried alongside with them. And from certain other finds, so certain graves that, for instance, do not have horses, but maybe other equipment, we can, however, believe that even if these guys were not buried with horses, they could be still cavalrymen of sort. Even in Italy, sometimes you find the Longobards being buried with some stirrups. There is a few evidence of this, but just to make an example, sometimes we even found things like, I don't know, the grave of a young girl with a stirrup. And it is pretty interesting because it shows that even girls at that point, little girls, I mean, we were talking about a child at that point, went on horseback, or at least it was a society that entailed that conceived this as a visible thing, even to more importantly, burying the girl together with a stirrup. So hinting at the fact that even in afterlife, in some way, this the horse riding could have been an activity of some sort. Now it's very moving in many ways if you think about this, and naturally it's the presence of a stirrup in that grave, for instance, doesn't necessarily tell much about the general the general picture. This is the point it was making at the beginning. We don't know whether this was just a form of affection, say from her parents, her family, say maybe she liked to horse ride particularly, so they buried a stirrup with her. But generally speaking, that can be interpreted also as a hint in general, as a whole, of a people that still was pretty much say attached to that kind of tradition that came from the so-called Barbaricum. So this world that for most of Longobard history actually was beyond even the Roman frontiers. You know that the Longobards were essentially very scarcely Romanized compared to other Germanic populations, probably the least Romanized, at least among those who eventually settled into the former Roman territories. And the same goes a bit like for the other graves. Naturally, most of the graves from which we can see the presence of a horse, or however certain equipment that suggests obviously this was considered that every Longobard male was considered a warrior. As adult male, at least, was considered a warrior. So we find even in here the tombs of young boys, of children that were buried with weapons. So that is quite meaningful because it tells you how militarized was that society. Of course, it's not that children really fought in war, but the idea is that these, even the same, if you look at the social composition of the Longobard people, you realize that, for instance, how important was the autonomy of the various parental groups. The Fare, for instance, they were essentially certain clans. The Fara is a Latinization of comes from the Germanic term fahren, which is basically to travel. And the Longobards were extremely egalitarian in nature compared to other Germanic populations. And so this basically meant it was a weak central power, at least at the beginning, before the settlement into Italy and the so-called anarchy period. And every clan was kind of free, and this paradoxically had granted a certain unity of the people as a whole, especially in military matters at the beginning. But in normal life, this basically meant that every clan was self-sufficient in many ways, in terms also of food gathering, even weapon reproduction, and so on. And these were populations that were mostly and prevalently about war. These were essentially clans of freemen that also had serfs or slaves, as you would consider them, that they basically drew from the subdued populations. The Longobards, telling the truth, were famous seemingly since the beginning also for being quite inclusive. Really, there was a ritual that is witnessed for Longobard history of the very origins that basically was aimed at freeing the slaves and therefore adopting them, integrating them into the Longobard people among the Longobard freemen, chiefly for military purposes. That is, increasing the essentially the manpower, the strength of the population, that albeit not very large, at least in the beginning, had managed to survive into the mess that could be Germany in the first millennium AD, and eventually to progressively grow at the point when they entered into Italy. They were some of the largest. I can't say confederation because that's not really the point, but let's say a group of peoples that had been seen during the migration era in the West. So from archaeological finds, therefore, one of the main problems is we don't know whether the freemen that are buried, let's say, without horses, without stirrups, were cavalrymen. as well. There is a lot of debate for this, because even if there is an important distinction you can make. One thing is being a fully nomadic people, where first of all you virtually have all the all men actually buried together with their horses. I think in the case of populations like the Scythians or the Sarmatians, and by the way, seemingly were also integrated in consistent numbers into the Longobard army, especially at the arrival of the Huns, is one thing. So you can say that those peoples really lived on horseback. One thing is having a population that maybe is sedentary, or at least for the Germans here you can say, what is semi-nomadic, what is sedentary, they're kind of fluid, flexible terms, if you want. There is no scientific categorization. You can say, oh, this is a nomadic, this is a semi-nomadic, this is a sedentary, because these were mobile populations that also are not very much documented. So we don't know in practice what their lifestyle in detail was. But and therefore you can find certain peoples that maybe were still largely had a sedentary life. I mean, it was semi-nomadic because we like to distinguish that lifestyle from a fully sedentary one. But objectively, if you look at Longobard history, it's not that they ever traveled that much or that far. The Longobard migrations were quite slow, and it was actually something very disorganic in many ways. I mean, it was literally all these clan groups that moved generation after generation, step by step, we can say. So at those times, technically, you could make all the way up from northern Germany to Italy in 1 year, if there was really no impediment in theory, in strictly material capabilities. The problem there was obviously the political and military situation that created other dynamics. So it's definitely very important to realize that if the Longobard migration took something like from northern Germany to eventually to Pannonia, to Moravia, and to Italy took 300-400 years, it's not because these populations were so particularly highly mobile. The shift happened quite progressively. It's also very difficult to track. Certain parts of the Longobard people actually remained even behind. They remained into northern Germany. They were eventually absorbed by the Saxons. And more generally, you have still to consider that the Germans, in previously to the migration era, had been kind of largely sedentary in fashion. I mean, of course, they had settlements, that kind of environmental situation that brought them not to be consistently rooted on a singular settlement. You can talk about semi-nomadism even before the migration. I don't know, the late antiquity, wherever you want the migration era start. I mean, the actual movement of these populations from Central Europe elsewhere. But I don't remember where I was going with this. I mean, I assume the idea is that they had, however, remained for several centuries, where they had been the Longobards. If they really migrated from Sweden, as the legend says, from Scandia, they basically remained into the north of Germany for roughly, let's say, more than 200-300 years. So it's not that they moved that much. However, it's this can go at different levels. I mean, maybe the whole people was settled there. Also here it's very difficult to tell who was who there, because the material culture is absolutely homogeneous, so you can't archaeologically distinguish the Longobards when they were in Germany from anyone. I mean, when the Romans invaded Germany, they defeated Longobards on the Elbe River, and they it was said by Tiberius that these were distinguished. We know that there were the Longobards there. It's explicitly stated by Tacitus that they were. So in this sense they were distinguishable, but and we know that they were roughly there, so maybe if archaeologically we see that there is a new group of people that settled exactly in that moment, in that particular place where we think the Longobards might have settled, we can say, okay, these perhaps are the Longobards, but otherwise there is no much other way to really to tell it. As a consequence, however, the general trend of Germanic warfare is that the Germans initially, let's say during the at the beginning of 1st century AD, essentially when the same Germans entered the Iron Age proper from their perspective, were essentially a infantry-based people in terms of warfare. I mean, it's pretty evident. Especially the Western Germans, the ones who lived in the forests of Western Germany, were practically the ones who made the least use of cavalry ever. I mean, they definitely had cavalry. Many people say, okay, well, they didn't know that they always maintained that. But let's say that the usage was pretty scarce. Germany wasn't a great environment for breeding horses. The terrain was also the climate was kind of awful. The terrain was quite awful. The Germans in general were an extremely primitive and poor people at the time. Yet they had this very high military average that was in fact related also to their lifestyle, because being not there so many resources, not much surplus to build something, building something larger than a village, these guys essentially coped with their needs, their dynamics, the need for new resources, by just fighting each other and going pillaging and raiding all around. So this made them, from one side, it prevented the construction of a central government to Germany, of a unitary. There were certain confederations, but some of them were also kind of nominal. They were very contractualistically conceived. The idea is that all these various peoples, and really the social pact was based on the idea that every German was a freeman practically. So the inherent idea was that we join all together when we have to fight, when you have to make war, but for the rest we have to remain alone. And this definitely brought from one side to the absence of a strong centralized government of some form. Secondly, this brought, however, to the increase of the individual qualities as fighters, as warriors, because at that point, lacking a central authority who could organize a solid army, a disciplined army, and to confer certain discipline and training, it was really the Germanic culture that had, without rationalizing it, developed like any other tribal society, by emphasizing really this warrior ethos, this idea that cowards were basically ostracized, and they were even morally dead practically. They were exiled from society, and a lot of emphasis was put on the individual skill and not on the collective skill. This is the reason why, however, the Germans at this point weren't really a big deal in terms of combat. As wall armies weren't considered actually that dreadful, and they were considered, however, extremely courageous. If you read this strategicon of the pseudo Mauritius, you can read in there all the list of the barbarian peoples that the Byzantines were fighting against. You realize that basically the Germans were considered, at least by the Byzantines, the less insidious in terms of actual in military art, practically. The best praise were the most praise were the Avars, because they were considered to be much more trained and effective and tactically dynamic and so on. The Germans were considered a bit as they most of all had this order and / logistical problems. That was the main weakness, but everybody recognized their individual prowess, I made that video on, in fact, the chapter of the Strategicon, which the title is Strategicon, the blonde-haired peoples, because this is how the Byzantines called these populations. And bear in mind that when the Strategicon was written, the main Germanic people were against which the Byzantines were fighting, or at least the ones that were more in contact with at that point, let's say, as a transient reason, were actually the Longobards. So even though we're talking there about a bit older Germans, including the Franks and so on, that is still to bear in mind. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Going back to the problem cavalry infantry ratio, from the graves of the first centuries, the current era, the common era, sorry, definitely the Longobards, if they were, that people that we find from the urns from the graves in northern Germany in the Bardengau area, were essentially infantrymen. I mean, that is pretty frequent. The presence of cavalry is witnessed all the time, but it was definitely much less than what it happened. It would have happened later. So that's perfectly normal. The Germans had this aristocracy who at least owned and knew how to fight on horse. In the Germanic world, really, as in most of the ancient world, this is often overlooked, especially in those tribal/warrior societies. Really, fighting on horseback was considered a form of cowardice. I mean, the true warrior had to fight on foot, or they definitely could come on the battlefield on horseback, but it was preferably to fight on foot, because the most obvious reason is that while you are on horseback, theoretically you can flee from the battlefield in a much quicker way. Whereas the warrior/heroic ethos of these tribesmen wanted that, you had to face the enemy on face to face on equal ground, and really fighting to the death on the battlefield. And these feelings were really, these ideals were really pretty common into the Longobard world, and this is something that Longobards had interiorized so much that they kept essentially, that they maintained essentially as their moral system, their system of virtues, even into Italy and beyond. So even when their military quality went down, so that because they weren't living into a primitive environment anymore, that they had kind of gentrified in many ways, and they weren't making war like they used to. However, they still thought that the real ideal of the Longobard freeman was to be a warrior, not to be a coward, and to be always brave, even at the point of fanatism, even at the point of putting in danger the collective, the whole formation, the whole unit. This had been one of the greatest problems of the Germanic armies at that point. I mean, every tribal army, arguably at that point, the individualism that was kind of more functional than in other armies, for essentially because the idea is that if you have an army that is not disciplined, that doesn't have a good supply slash logistical system, and you can't this is what the Romans were stressed when they described these populations, that they lacked resources. They couldn't last on a battlefield for more than some day, and that's pretty obvious. They didn't have a state like the Roman one who could bring supplies and so on. These were also relatively small peoples. They were often surviving, as we have seen, in environments where booty was the first form of surplus they could have. They didn't have a stable income, and that reason for which also they had also to move so frequently and increasing their mobility eventually. So they compensated, as we've said before, with the individual prowess, and even tactically speaking, putting this huge emphasis on the first massive charge that was aimed at breaking the enemy resist, the enemy ranks in one shot, and that was pretty dangerous. The Romans were perfectly aware that they were capable of coping with it, but you know, that was really the most dangerous moment when you faced a Germanic army at that point. And you know, in the phase of northern Germany, let's say before the migration era, the Germanic, let's say the Longobards, in terms of army compositions, really fitted broadly into the German average. They had very few cavalry. I mean, maybe not excessively few, because the Longobards were settled on the moors of the Elbe River, and if they were part initially of this Swabian confederation, albeit in a very loose way, because they were on the border in many ways. Probably the Longobards participated to the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. They, even though we don't have an actual, but I mean, surely bands of tribesmen, Longobard tribesmen, did participate. They also launched several offensives along the Danubian front at one point. Actually, the Longobard people has a brilliant history. I will have to cover at one point, because it's really remarkable in many ways, especially considering that all the sources stress that they were a small people, and that which compensated with quality, their military quality, essentially. The Longobards were considered extremely ferocious. The Romans wrote that the Longobards were this tiny people that, however, took pride from being at war constantly with all the neighbors. So it's better not to be a Longobard neighbor. That's the moral of the story. And that they were more ferocious than the Germanic, you know, the Germanic savagery, essentially, the Germanic ferocity. So this is a kind of interesting note that actually fits with almost everything else we know about the Longobards in that age. I mean, the mosaic, if you puzzle it kind of makes sense when you study Longobard history. So people that really had a huge emphasis on their military prowess, on their warlike nature and warlike character. So we know at a certain point the Longobards put themselves in motion. We don't really know, because essentially from the time of the Marcomannic Wars until when they settled into Moravia and in Pannonia, so when they re-entered the Byzantine rudder, practically, we don't know literally anything about them. We have some hint about, you know, certain names that recall the Longobards might have been them out there during, especially under the Hunnic domination. The Longobards seemingly were extremely influenced by the Huns in their military, in their warfare at the beginning of the 5th century. So that's the moment in which, for several factors, the Longobards began to increase their cavalry units. However, their cavalry in number. Seemingly, however, in my opinion, maintaining the majority of their forces on foot. There are several reasons why cavalry increases. The point I was making before is that basically east of the Western German forests, Germany basically opens up. You know, it goes also towards Poland, so there is more flat land, essentially. It was not a easy territory as well, because those were territories covered with, in part, with forests and swamps, etc. But let's say that cavalry was seemingly more developed in the east at all times, and here, and that even the Longobards, that weren't probably Eastern Germans, but actually Elbe Germans, were kind of a bit more. They had already maybe a bit of cavalry more than other Western Frankish populations. But really, the moment in which the Longobards increased their numbers in cavalry was during this phase of the migration that began at some point between the 2nd and the especially it probably happened actually in the 3rd century in AD. the integration of all those peoples of Iranic stocks, refugees, like the Sarmatians that were fleeing from the Mongols towards the west, so entering Germany and being absorbed like as broken peoples now, because they had been, in a hurry now, or had already been defeated by the Huns in some way. So the Longobards at that point, while on the march, were absorbing these eastern elements that were probably, bringing also this kind of equestrian zootechnic abilities of some sort, and increasing their cavalry contingent, but however diluted enough to basically become part of the Longobard people as a whole, that had this very strong and very well distinguished identity compared to other populations. Consider that the Longobards one of those very few peoples that maintained their original ethnonym throughout all, from the origins to the end of their history. I mean, populations like the Franks, the Alemanni, etc., those were all new names of other tribes that had existed before. They were confederations in name. The Franks were descending mostly from those western tribes we know. They simply changed name. The Longobards maintained always their own name, never confederated with other tribes. The word the Longobards point, and this stresses also why, they were considered so, so fiercely independent and warlike, because they had based their tribal identity on their military character. If anything, they called themselves Longobards. Originally, their name was Vinnili. When they came from Scandinavia, according to the legend, then they were adopted by Odin in a military function, and they adopted this nickname, the Longobards. This epithet, if you want. Actually, in positive terms. I don't know why. I think in English, epithet is derogatory in many ways, but I don't think so. I don't think this was the real. However, the long bears, that is a character that Odin had, a characteristic that Odin had, and therefore they thought to be adoptive sons of the major warrior figure in the Germanic pantheon at the time, Odin. That was quite important because we have been talking much about Odinism on Schwerpunkt, in Migration Era playlist, or in the I don't remember, in the, well, yeah, you should find there that there's a lot about Odinism, the Germanic fury, this idea that the Germanic fury is not fury as we intended today, just being angry or crazy, but just, being essentially possessed by the divine wisdom rather than the fury, in this kind of military and warrior spirit that is able to deliver, in fact, the divine wrath on the battlefield. And it's plenty of these of anecdotes in Longobard history that we can't cover. I should start talking about that in detail on Schwerpunkt, on a dedicated playlist and dedicated series, because I think it's very interesting. And they began to increase their numbers in cavalry, and also third factor, because of the Hunnic domination. So these are kind of normal events. The people had become more mobile, had integrated elements of nomadic populations. They remained for a very long time similarly under the Hunnic domination, so the domination of a horse-riding people. There is not really evidence, but enough hints to suggest, in fact, the Longobards were the last Germanic people that freed itself from the Hunnic domination. And this would explain so much, telling the truth, in the of the Longobard warrior's outlook as mounted warriors equipped with armor, at least their elite, wearing armor that was extremely similar, actually virtually identical to all the steppes armor that you can find from the Pannonian Plain to the Bering Strait. So all over Eurasia. So this very strong character has led many people to say, okay, well, at this point the Longobards were kind of horse-riding peoples on their own. They were so nomadic people. Well, this is actually, in my opinion, this is not really true. I mean, this has been overly emphasized. It's been overly emphasized because, although we don't know, first of all, from our graves, we see that the Longobards had still a large quantity of people who fought on foot by default. I mean, probably these warriors were all able to fight on horseback in some fashion. This is the really important distinction. The problem is not all of them necessarily had always to fight on foot, to fight on horseback. All the evidence that we also have from other Germanic populations by analogy tell us that if you look at the loaves of recruitment, also the one that the Longobards created, albeit in Italy, so what they were essentially sedentarized, is that the social segmentation of the Germanic armies was always including large amounts of infantrymen. This is pretty normal. There is no evidence that these populations were fully nomadic. Excuse me. Stupid spring. So, as far as we know, always a bulk of the population remained substantially very similar in outlook, in fashion, in substance, in structure to the German origins. So essentially a sedentary population. No doubt, I repeat, I'm sure that every single Longobard freeman in the 6th century knew how to fight on horseback, could even dispose of a horse. If anything, because these were, as we've seen, even the economy, from what we know, was based entirely on cattle. So the idea is that if you own cows or stuff like that, you still can own a horse quite easily, and you most likely know how to fight on it. That's pretty standard in many ways. But nevertheless, even if we read the Strategicon, we see that these Germanic peoples were conceived to have been fighting both on horseback and on foot, and actually that there is a substantial emphasis on also on the infantry of of infantry formations. So for this, I really bring to the early redirect to the video on the blonde-haired-peoples, because I discuss in detail in there. But the idea is it's pretty simple. These guys had essentially a numerical bulk of infantrymen, quite likely, and consistent numbers of cavalry by the 6th century. The Strategicon emphasizes also that the equipment was pretty standard. There was no substantial differentiation. They were equipped with also what defining the graves. Essentially, the average equipment was a lance, and a shield. Then most of the Longobards at this time, or at least a consistent part of them, also used swords, spade. This is very important because the Longobards at this point seemingly had a very well-off middle class. So the average Longobard was not an impoverished freeman like the one of other populations, like the Gepids, for instance, that the Longobards defeated, perhaps exactly for this reason. The freemen as a class were pretty well off. There were aristocracies that definitely ruled over the people, but there was no let's say, hegemonic ruler in there. The Longobards also had a history during the migration phase that necessarily brought for some leader to be put at the top of society, to essentially to guide the population. But even if the Byzantines, when the Longobards settled in Pannonia, gave to the people this, they backed essentially Alboin's clan as a sovereign ruler. Basically, the Longobards never absorbed this idea of kingship until essentially the creation of the kingdom in Italy. That also came, in fact, after kind of a generation after the settlement, because they didn't want to have it initially. So it didn't really belong to their culture, but eventually they understood it, and actually they created a kingdom that, in spite of every stupid prejudice that I don't know why still exists out there, was actually a pretty good kingdom, and a pretty centralized one. The myth that I've been stressing it so much, the myth of the Longobards as a divided kingdom, is probably one of the most stupid things that I don't know how they even came up with in historiography. This is something I've been discussing. If you go to the Longobard history playlist I made, I discussed this extensively. Please, let's stop about these prejudices about the Longobards, because they are just plain stupid. I mean, we can't go on like this. The point I was making, though, is that the Longobard middle class was seemingly pretty well off, and in the Longobard graves, in fact, we find a much higher proportion of swords than in other peoples. Now, having a sword at the time might have been we're talking about the 6th century Europe, so in a moment in which the continent was actually pretty devastated by things like, the plague, continuous wars, the migration era that had kind of made a mess everywhere. So we see also from the Byzantine army, think about the Gothic War, things like that, a great material poverty, even of equipment. I know we have Byzantine cavalrymen, so basically the soldiers of the best and richest country at the time that were, short of metal protections. They created armor basically with wood, literally, and wood is actually good. It's not the best, but it's still it's better than nothing, and it has certain important qualities. Well, finding in 6th century graves in Pannonia all of these swords in there, it's actually pretty significant, and specifically significant of a solid material wealth of the Longobard middle class. This probably had come, as we have seen, considering the Longobards had been victorious over other populations like the Heruli, for instance, eventually the Gepids and so on, that basically they had, this was the consequence of loot of a victorious people that had managed basically to defeat and swallow others on their path, and basically strengthening their manpower, and also, however, the possessions of the freemen. So we can imagine many serfs also fighting alongside the Longobards, and that's also very important, because the so-called Aldiones, or Aldi as they were called, were in fact this serf class that normally was issued to fight on foot, not even usually with spears or shields or spears or swords actually, but just with shield and bow, and shield and quiver. So that was it. So there was definitely a group of a number of troops in the Longobard army that was dedicated to that. I mean, even if you look at the contingent that was sent to serve the Byzantines during the Gothic War, well, seemingly this was a sort of picked body of Longobard cavalrymen together with certain serfs or assistants. We don't really know much what they were like, but seemingly there was even a sort of feudal nature in mind. So of course we can't talk about feudalism for the Longobards at all, but the concept, however, was deeply rooted into the Germanic world, that the stronger ruled over the vanquished, really entailed these relations of dependency. And if you read the Edict of Rotary, you find how important serfs were into Longobard society, and how widespread that practice really was. So, however, having a spada, a sword, in iron slash steel, that was a big thing in that time, considering how really poor that world was, and also considering that the Longobards settled into areas before Italy that weren't really very, very florid, especially the Danubian frontier, those areas of Pannonia, etc., were areas of the empire that had always kind of a military nature and had not seen a huge urban development. Also, they had declined relatively early. So the Longobards were coming from the Barbaricum of beyond the Danube, and then settling there. So it was a very poor world, an extremely poor world, and nevertheless these guys were well equipped. So that really speaks. It's another hint that tells you how, probably how many peoples that they had defeated in that context to be equipped so well as that. As a matter of fact, the only peoples we know they defeated were the Heruli and the Gepids, really. But the idea is that along the way, definitely they surely fought with some other group. Unfortunately, we don't really know much about it, but we can conjecture it in some way. At this point, therefore, we have the Strategicon as well, that is contemporary, from the second half of the 6th century, seemingly. And interestingly enough, it says that the Longobards were perfectly capable of fighting in hand-to-hand combat, both on horseback and on foot. The Strategicon also states that when these peoples were put into difficulty by action of cavalry, they usually dismounted at a given signal, and they deployed on foot. This is very interesting because, first of all, it implies that these guys were fighting on horseback very often, but that they could dismount. Cavalry had increased in importance on the battlefields dramatically in the last centuries at this point, but it wasn't definitely heavy cavalry that would be developed in the High Middle Ages. This was a cavalry that could still be effectively stopped by a good infantry, and it wasn't actually very structured. It actually was a pretty loose. They had a scarce collective training. This is very important, as we've seen. The same political and social structure of these Germanic populations was pretty weak. Generally, there were all these scattered clans, so even the chances of really finding in large ordered masses of troops was pretty. On a regular base, was pretty rare. So this means that a normal Longobard army would be the coming together, the assembly of so many different clans that were actually cyclically drawn up for this thing. The idea is that every freeman had to fight. So there was a general assembly of the Longobard people that is also witnessed as a founding element of the Longobard kingdom in the Edict of Rotary. Kings were chosen during the military assemblies, like the Germanic tradition wanted. This was kept being done actually throughout all the Italian part of the Longobard history. When the kingdom was now consolidated, the Longobards had basically been absorbed by the Romanic population. So this was really the ethos, the idea that all these clans came together. But in terms of training, of collective training, there was a very few of that. If I'm not wrong, the Strategicon states, in fact, that the cavalry charges were actually pretty impetuous and very quick, but they lacked cohesion, basically. In fact, they said that they really didn't deploy into battle in a pre-established formation or in according to certain organical repartitions, but on the base of tribes, on the base of clans. So this was perfectly normal, and that stresses the importance that this individual, even attachment to the family, the group of this, monad of the pharaoh, how important it really was. And that is brilliantly showed also in the fashion in which the Longobard people settled into Italy, because instead than working as a big compact mass that could, at that point, given the number of Byzantine presence, completely sweep out the imperials from the peninsula, they basically departed in so many different directions individually, and settled autonomously, like they had been used to do in the Barbaricum, with the only difference that in the Barbaricum, the cohesion of the people overall was maintained, because it was such a poor place that there were not many options but sticking together. Arriving in Italy, then, in spite of the plague and the devastations, was still I think, the richest country at that point. Well, Gaul was richer, but let's say Italy was also consistently florid. They basically scattered all over, trying to seize everything they wanted. So that eventually brought to many problems, aside from the fact that some of the Longobards actually stuck eventually with the Byzantines, and trying to defeat basically the other Longobards. So it was a pretty messy situation. We'll have to cover that part of history a bit. So everything was a bit substantially chaotic, and it's only with the creation of the kingdom that basically this idea of a common military service is reinforced, and there were this kind of autonomous, the ducal autonomies. The Longobards nobility were called the dukes in Italy, according to a Latin definition, because they were military leaders. So the dux is different from the comes, for instance, like you find it among the Franks. So the Longobards also hear that they stress their own strictly military nature. They started, however, to put together all these duchies and trying to make coordinated military expeditions and so on, in a fashion that was similar to the other Romano-Germanic kingdoms, really. And then they weren't that bad, actually. So that's the real... coming back to what the Strategicon was saying, is that cavalry basically lacked coordination. It's interesting because in the same Strategicon, at one point, among the various formations that are issued for the Roman cavalry, there is one that I think it was the Drungos, if I'm not wrong, or that was, no, maybe I'm confused. But if you look into the Byzantine history playlist, or Cavalry Warfare playlist, because I created new playlists now that can be useful. I made a video about the Byzantine cavalry, the 6th century Roman cavalry's battle formations. This is the title, in which it emphasizes that in certain situations you can even charge en masse without a great order, exploiting speed, and really trying to surprise the enemy in that fashion. This is interesting because it basically meant that can highlight kind of an influence also that in the Roman army existed from these populations in here. Not much because the Romans had really to learn it from the Germans, but really fighting against them, they might have been puzzled by these fast, quick charges that maybe, although not coordinated, were still very quite impetuous. So in order to cope with them, they were essentially doing the same thing. But here it says when they're put into danger, as we've seen in discomfort by cavalry, by the enemy cavalry, they dismount and fight on foot. This is pretty interesting. It shows how infantry was still better than cavalry at that point. You'd say, well, but why didn't they just fight on infantry on foot then? Well, because while you're on horseback and you're facing other horsemen, you have an intrinsic mobility that you can use to exploit the enemy. So you have many more options. You can also actually run away, which is something that against the ideals of these Germanic populations was still done pretty frequently, and as well as in any other people. So dismounting at that point, means it increases your strength, but at the same point it means you basically give up to the chance of being more mobile, to even run away. So what the strategical really talks about sounds really like a last stand in some way. And we don't have to think, in fact, the Longobards didn't have infantry. On the contrary, here it says that quite explicitly that, if you give me the both on horseback and on foot they were impetuous and ill-disciplined in the charge, as if they were the only ones in the world not to be cowards. This is also very important. All the sources stress the extreme courage of these Germanic populations when they fought. Here it says, in fact, that they even they felt contempt for good order, especially on horseback. This is particularly important because it intrinsically means that they were more careful about the way they deployed on foot, which is very interesting and also very meaningful, because on horseback, of course, things can get messed up also in terms of cohesion more easily. It's more difficult to keep order in a cavalry formation than on an infantry formation, which also means that you also have to delegate more resources for collective training, which these guys didn't have for cavalry, and therefore made cavalry less disciplined in this sense. And there is that part on the front line that is important. Yeah, here it says, which if you really read the whole paragraph on the blonde-haired-peoples, it sounds a bit like a contradiction in some ways, because basically the author is emphasizing the lack of order more than else. It definitely was particularly evident in front, especially of the Roman armies. Also in here, it's a bit of a cliche, because you don't have to think that Roman armies at this point were extremely more disciplined, also because for the simple fact that it was plenty of barbarians in the same Roman armies. So yeah, however, the Romans still maintain at this point a very high level of training. That were the first class military in their so there was a difference of some sort, but in actual warfare, things tend to get pretty blended in many ways. After all, in fact, the same Longobards fought at this point, even in large numbers, into the Byzantine army as well. And here it says one phrase that is very interesting. It says that in combat they formed up. They formed the front of their line of battle in a compact and uniform fashion. This is what I was searching for. This is very important because it tells you what many people still think it's kind of fantasy, that is, the barbarians actually had a solid and uniform front line. And guess what? Every single rabble of people that fights together tends to stick together. So the myth of the barbarian who fought barbarian armies who fought scattered, running around like you see in movies and so on, and it's completely false. It's a myth. Every single source that talks about the barbarian front lines in history at every time take the Celts, take the Germans, then take the Dacians, anyone. We obviously know that these guys fought with a compact and uniform front. And that's how humans fight. There is no much other way out. Before, we definitely talk about this individualistic ethos that brought maybe one crazy ass to launch himself into the midst of the enemy, usually being slaughtered. That was a way to show off in a world that was extremely competitive from a from this point of view. But those were exceptions. We'll also talk about them later. These troops, especially infantry, really fought and moved as one. That was arguably the best thing they could do, essentially for the primary objective of maintaining carrying out an effective charge. The charge gets disrupted and becomes useless if you lose cohesion. So the thing that these peoples were essentially putting the emphasis on was staying together during the charge, creating a compact front while really charging all together and smashing it to the enemy lines at once, because that was actually the best they could do. And it was a very quick thing, and if that failed, most likely, the world battle failed, because they didn't have many other ways to maintain cohesion afterwards, nor to resist for a prolonged time in these operations. So it was everything immediately. The great charge. Even this fact, the idea that the Strategicon explicitly states that, for instance, the Germans were put into difficulty by heat, by cold, by rain, by lack of provisions, especially of wine, is very important, because you say, oh, the Germans can't stand cold. Well, let's get rid of these myths as if there were certain peoples that are better suited for certain climates, because humans are completely identical, virtually identical in terms, and the human body does adapt to temperature wherever it goes. So it's not that the Germans resisted heat or cold better or worse than any other people on Earth. This is not the point. It's whoever thinks this things doesn't really have much clear ideas about biology. But the problem is here, what really the author means is that basically these guys were so vulnerable, the Germanic armies were vulnerable to the lack of provisions. The idea is that you can resist the weather only if you have an effective supply system that can bring you clothes and food. And why does it say, especially the lack of wine was a thing apparently to the Germanic armies? Well, it's interesting because wine, first of all, I was making some considerations, because wine wasn't actually even grapes you don't find them in Central and Eastern Europe at this point. You're just in, either it was boat, or now obviously the author is talking about certain Germanic peoples that had settled into the Mediterranean. But okay, yeah, on the Danube and on the Upper Rhine, there were grapes at the time as well. But this is not the point. The real point here, which is just a detail. The detail is that the important thing is that wine is a perfect resource for fighting in the kind of fashion the Germans did, because wine gives you these immediate calories that are immediately spent. It kind of makes you feel a bit unconscious. I mean, that can make you lose inhibition. So it was the best for the charges. We see repeatedly in military history how fighters who had to undergo things like charges, things that obviously were terrible, devastating psychologically speaking. They took drugs, they drank, they had some way that could they assumed certain substances that could somehow make them feel I mean, conscious enough really to do what they had to do, but having this immediate energy, this immediate that put them into a state that they wouldn't think too much about what they were doing, and especially for a charge like these Germans were doing in order to smash enemy lines, that was fundamental. Drinking before the action. So even the lack of wine, this immediate, calorie giver, let's say, this immediate, it was very important, was very functional for their kind of warfare, exactly for these reasons. Another very interesting thing it says here is the Germans didn't obey to their chiefs. Lack of discipline. So imagine this cavalry or infantry formations of the Longobards really fighting as in clans, where there was a kind of there was a discipline that basically didn't, it rarely went beyond the clanic group practically, and therefore managing these armies in battle was kind of complicated. This is also in part probably why infantry had kind of importance, because infantry was more controllable in general. So that's where the most of these peoples would basically put their emphasis on. Here it also says that they were usually not good at fighting on rough terrain because they used spears. Interestingly enough, the Byzantine manual advises to basically lure these peoples onto broken terrain in order to make lose them the cohesion with spears. Very interesting, because it shows how the spear actually was used in this compact formations. And it was functional definitely to a cohese infantry fighting style. So this is another indicator that actually infantry was a thing, and that it was the Byzantines thought of this way to weaken it. So many hints that actually tell us how infantry was important among these populations. Going to back to the infantry equipment, also in here, it doesn't make much of a sense to distinguish it from the one of cavalry, as we've seen that these guys also often fought on horse, both on horseback and on foot at the same time. The average Longobard freeman's equipment was definitely a sword, a shield, and a lance. The lance probably was more prevalent for many reasons. Many people think that the sword is superior to the lance. This is not true, and this is not true, especially in formation. Formations with spears are definitely have an edge over formations with swords, but most of these fights, this combat, can't say degenerated. Also, the spears can break, and the fight could turn into something relatively more individualistic. So this Pata was definitely the second option. When your lance was broken, you just launch yourself in that way. That you have to imagine an extremely dynamic combat in many ways. You have to imagine this to formations of infantry formations really clashing one another, keeping more or less a good cohesion, and clashing for 30 seconds, then distancing, then taking breath, and resting for some minute, and then reapproaching and being screened also by bowmen. Bowmen, as we've seen, were usually the poorer classes, very often the non-free troops, but there was surely some Longobard at this point who was so poor that eventually was even to lose his own freedom because of this. So participating into the army was actually a privilege. But these other lighter troops that are often forgotten were equally important. And actually we see that also in these graves of 6th century Pannonia, etc., there was plenty of arrows, and we have bows and arrows in many other graves, including the ones of horses, of horsemen, sorry. So we have horse archers, basically. These guys could use bow in every kind of condition, like every other weapon at that point. These infantries would kind of clash back and forth. The spears would progressively break down, so someone would pass to the swords and trying to launch certain desperate assaults into the enemy in line when it was deemed to be weaker. We said before that everything was based really on a big charge, but you can't really do it all the time. Ideally, preferably on an open ground, that's what you want to do. But these charges happen also. They're repeated over and over again. I mean, the charge we were talking before is, a great charge meant as the whole army kind of advancing, assaulting, but not necessarily, at an individual level. On the contrary, probably most of these battles were fought with an alternation of a sequence of charges, naturally decreasing in power over time. So that's why the first ones were very important, because at that point you had the greater forces to be spent, and therefore you could inflict the heavier damage. You could disrupt the enemy formation in a more effective way than what you could do later when you were exhausted to do so. So that was also probably the most important moment, which could test where, in the enemy battle line where the enemy was weaker. Cavalry was probably doing the same exact thing and backing infantry or being backed by infantry depending on the situation, and all these archers screening the army essentially and protecting the flanks and hitting the enemy between a clash and another, between a charge and another. So pretty messed up situation that, by the way, shows also with the presence of arrows that is so frequent in Longobard equipment, the importance that this weapon had assumed, especially during the migration era. I think in Germany we have a very few evidence of arrows, which is also matches with what we know in general about the rest of the Germans. In here, instead, during the migration era, arrows seem to increase dramatically. This is very interesting because it might be a kind of a response also to the horse archers of the steppes that somewhat roamed around, and a very good effective way to counter horse archers are foot archers, especially when they are defended by lines of spearmen, because the horse archers is usually not heavy enough to break into the spearmen, and therefore when it approaches to them in the same while it can be bombarded with arrows. So that's a pretty good tactics, and it would explain why the Longobards put so many emphasis on that as well. So that's pretty clear. But as we've said, actually all the Longobards probably used bows effectively. If anything, that's what you do when you go hunting, when you live out there in the wilderness, and that's how these people lived basically. So they could use really every kind of weapon at that point. So talking about the normal equipment, the Longobards had usually linen tunics, were dyed with various colors. Many people represent them kind of iconically with these broad bands, either stripes or wide hem bands. But probably, this was there was a kind of a recognition, reason for these patterns, but it's not, we can't really think of a uniform or something that remained unvaried over time. Okay, maybe we have to we had started the thing with we had started with equipment. Let's end with equipment. Sorry, I was just skipping to the clothes. So we were saying the main weapon was the spear, before even the spada. Also, the spear was kind of the Germanic or the tribal in general weapon, per excellence. The same Germans take the name from the spear. It's Ger, spear, so German, so, and Hermann, so it would be essentially the spearman, the army man. That's what basically the German means. So the spear had also so many symbolic values. Even in Longobard history, it was somewhat attached to this ritual. Freed slaves were freed by being touched on the shoulder or on the head with a spear head. There was even, the Gungnir was the sacred sword of Woden, sacred spears of Woden / Odin. So the spear was very important. It was very effective, especially in formation. It's superior to the sword. The sword, however, was kind of rising in importance at this time. The Germans were actually very poor in metals back in the day when they were very primitive. They got introduced to these weapons essentially to iron weapons by the Celts. They started adopting this more solid spade in contact with the Celts and partly the Romans eventually. So they started developing this, with these longer swords in essentially in those first centuries in AD in a consistent fashion, and it seems that metallurgy during the migration era was undergoing a kind of a development and a bettering in many ways. The metallurgical center of Europe was in Roman times in this period, also during late antiquity, had shifted from the Alpine area of Noricum to the Rhineland, to the Upper Rhine area. So it had passed, essentially, it has shifted from the hands of the Celts to the hands of the Germans in many ways. And the Germans were attributing now to their swords kind of a alter ego nature of the warrior in itself. They considered these swords to be magic. Metallurgy was, since very ancient times, in all Indo-European cultures, related to these magical rites for which the sword was kind of a derivation from the telluric forces of the underworld. It conferred this great power. It was magic in many ways, and the quality of these swords, in fact, was exchanged for magic sometimes. And I will have to discuss this on Schwerpunkt sooner or later when looking at these things closer. The Germanic world was growing obsessed with this idea of this word that was the alter ego of the warrior. The same Longobard king Albavin basically dies in the typical Germanic heroic fashion, with a betrayal, because his wife, the Japid princess Rosmunda, had tied his sword to the bed. Naturally, the sword is a symbol of virility as well, and she called her lover to assassinate Albavin, who couldn't pick up this sword and was stabbed with a knife or another sword. I don't remember, and killed like that. And the swords were treasured. So it's also very interesting in many ways that the Longobards and other peoples at one point had swords to spend to be buried, and not just to be treasured and and handed down generation after generation. So also those 6th century graves are very meaningful, because the sword is so widespread. It tells you that these guys had probably several ones, at least in a lifetime that they could afford. Even the loss at every generation to bury one sword together with them in their clanic nucleus. So it's kind of interesting. And the sword, the spada, as you know, is a weapon that is primarily designed for cutting. It has its balance shifted towards the head, which makes it therefore also a very good weapon for cavalry combat. Can essentially give this very powerful blows from the above, and this is how it was basically conceived for. Functional for cavalry combat, as we've seen, in fact, as the Longobards were keen on. and it was kind of a primary weapon. Then we've seen bows were also pretty widespread. Throwing axes, the Longobards definitely are witnessed using throwing axes, like the Francesca, that is often conceived as a national weapon of the Franks, but actually was used by literally every single Germanic people in the same identical fashion. There was a throwing axe. It was used also as a normal axe, by the way, but the idea is that the Germans were using this weapon as a gap opener into the enemy ranks. The Germans, we have no evidence for the Longobards, but there was this other weapon. In fact, it was something similar. It was the Angen. The Angen was essentially the Germanic version of the Roman pilum. If anything, however, it had the same. In fact, it had the same degree of penetration, basically. And it was primarily designed. In fact, it remained sticked into the shields. It had also barbed head, often to create these horrendous wounds into which oxygen and bacteria could enter and infect it. So it's probable that, although we have no direct witness, that also the Longobards sometimes made use of Angens, definitely as well. The Longobards surely used javelins that are definitely witnessed also in here. But the throwing axe was seemingly a thing, and there was probably some kind of a symbolism attached to this. We know also in the Longobard tradition that the King Authary was excellent at this craft of throwing. The throwing axe from horseback, interestingly enough, we have this story that basically he had gone to meet his future wife in incognito in Bavaria, because he was the first Longobard king of Italy. You know, he was the one who created the Italic kingdom proper, and he had gone to Bavaria to meet his wife, that Theodolinda, was extremely important in Longobard history because she was Catholic already, while the Longobards were still Arian. She eventually became a great queen. Authary was similarly assassinated, and she eventually chose the new king herself, because the Longobards gave a huge importance to women in many ways. The Longobard women recur so often in their history. She chose Agilulf, who also converted. Started essentially the conversion of the Longobards to Catholicism, which was actually not a very dramatic passage, as is often believed. The Saint Columba was given the permission at that time to found in Bobbio, in the Longobard kingdom, by his monastery, by in fact Agilulf and Theodolinda, so very important characters. However, Authary, Theodolinda's former husband, king of the Longobards, had gone to Bavaria in incognito and had met her, and there's all the story. It would be interesting to tell, but it's no point. When he was coming back to Italy, in the Alps, he was escorted by these Bavarian cavalrymen, and when he reached the Italic frontier, he had not revealed himself yet. So Paul the Deacon states that he rose on the top of the horse as much as he could, and threw this throwing axe towards a tree and hit it perfectly, and claimed, it is the way Authary strikes. So he revealed himself, and that's very important because it also basically states it's also a symbol of the full sedentarization of the Longobards, and now we're looking at Italy as kind of a natural, as their own land, essentially, also in a geographical fashion. So that's where their kingdom finally began. So they weren't migrating peoples anymore. Now they had a land and were sedentarizing. That was their own territory. But aside from that, it's interesting because Paul the Deacon stresses that Authary rose himself as much as he could on his horseback, and that's something you can do in many ways. People might have thought, that's the indirect proof of a stirrup. Stirrups existed in Longobard equipment, but they weren't so widespread at all. What people overlook is that these guys had a hell of a body. In terms of muscular force, these were fighting literally all their lives. Just everybody who goes on horseback knows how much the muscles of legs are necessary to be developed to go on a horse. So the idea of rising up on the top of a horse with your thighs is very, it's very important. In this, it's very feasible. It's normal for a cavalryman, and this idea of throwing this perfect, precise shot with the axe that hit perfectly its target really reveals this in the Paul de Diegon's history of the Longobards. Still at a couple of centuries of distances, how important that military virtue and using that weapon really was. So it's very, very important in many ways. Then another typical weapon was the scramasax. The scramasax, in the English word, you usually think about it mostly as the seax from the Anglo-Saxons. It was actually also in here. It was not a national weapon. Literally, all the Germans used this, and in many ways, the sax could really vary even in length. It could be a tiny knife in length, like some inch. Then it could be almost like a saber, 70 centimeters saber. I think in one of the Longobard finds in northern Italy has been found something like that. And at that point, it looks much more like a saber. In fact, like the ones the Avars that were bordering the Longobards used. It's also very interesting that this scramasax was found into Italy and not in other finds out there into Central Europe, which led many people to suggest that at this point the Longobard scramasax kind of lengthened into Italy. I think there is no structural evidence for this tendency. I just think that it was normal that there were scramasaxes of different lengths, and that we were lucky just to find one that was so long, but this doesn't mean that it had been lengthened into Italy. Nevertheless, it's very interesting that still in Italy such weapons that also are particularly effective on horseback, a 70 centimeters blade, narrow blade like one of scramasax, is perfect on horseback as a saber. You can imagine all these frontier warfare into Italy between the Longobards and the Byzantines, with mounted combat, these ambushes and raids and so on. This could be a very useful weapon. Then the main defense, if you look at Longobard infantryman, is definitely the shield. It was a pretty, relatively large round shield. It could be something like even 60 centimeters, 70 centimeters in diameter, even more. So it was rather large, which suggests, it really doesn't go beyond much the Germanic average, but there are substantial differences. For instance, it seems that the first the Anglo-Saxon shields of the 6th century, during the conquest of Britain, were very smaller. Whereas if you look at these Longobard shields, they're substantially large. It's interesting. It might reveal actually that this dimension had been functional to a kind of warfare that saw a greater use of arrows, especially considering that the Germans on this eastern frontier were exposed to all these nomadic populations. Speaking about the Huns, we've seen before, now the Avars and so on. So yeah, it kind of makes sense. You want something that basically protects you better, stops. It's a normal round shield with an ambo, riveted rims, and other decorative things. There is not a great change in Longobard equipment actually from Central Europe into Italy. There is some differentiation, but it's more decorative than substantial. The kind of equipment remain really the same. When we get to talk about armor, doesn't matter how the Longobard middle class freemen was well off. Armor was still something too expensive for him, and only the elite wore armor. The average Longobard, like the average fighter at the migration era, was unarmored, or at least it had a very few armor. It had probably padded clothing, stuff like that, but also for environmental reasons, for temperature and so on. But we find a very few evidence of a Longobard armor. Nevertheless, the few one we have is this iconical one with a scale, a lamellar armor, essentially, which is typical of the steppes, as we said. So lamellar helm, lamellar armor. There is the famous Niedersotzingen helm, which I think is actually an Alemannic find in southern Germany. But that perfectly fits with the Longobard iconography as well. I mean, contemporary Longobard iconography, which really shows these bodyguards, for instance, of Agilulf in a plague that look like they could be a Khan's bodyguards. I mean, they really look like warriors of the steppes. This lamellar armor covers them from head to toe, practically, just the face, being uncovered. So that was really the elite thing. It tells you how much the steppes' influence was, how strong it really was, and how much these populations had absorbed probably certain even styles that the Huns had brought in. So also in here, and this is a general notion you can apply to many times in history, not necessarily absorbing a type of armor means that you basically fight in the same way that the people who made that armor does. People get tricked about this all the time. It's like when in the ancient world people look at non-Hellenic peoples who wore hoplitic equipment and say, oh, those guys then fought just like in the Hellenic phalanx. It's completely false. The same goes for here. The Longobards had this very strongly influenced Eastern steppe, strongly steppe-like influence, but they didn't necessarily fight as steppes peoples. Surely they had very strong affinities, especially in outlook and certain elements, but they still were mostly a Germanic people in the essential. They mostly had infantry. Cavalry was so in quality, nothing to do with the highly trained cavalrymen of the steppes who really literally spent their whole life on horseback. These were great cavalrymen on their own, but they lacked the cohesion of the steppes peoples. So they could be excellent individual fighter on horseback, but still not reaching the degree of order that was necessary to carry out those very complex maneuvers. And in fact, in the Byzantine manuals are recorded for populations like the Avars, for instance, and that said, if you look in the same strategicon, the exact opposite of that is the Longobard cavalry. Basically, if you look at all, is this Blond-haired-peoples cavalry. If you look at all the populations in parallel, you realize that perhaps just the Slavs had a weaker or almost non-existent cavalry compared to the Germans, but the Germans weren't particularly bright either, although they did really like to fight on horseback. This is also a very important thing to notice, that there are populations in history that are kind of praised for their cavalry, or where people think that it just takes to be keen on cavalry to have a strong cavalry. No. It's just the case for the Celts, for instance. They're usually thought, Celtic cavalry was so strong, just because the Celts use objectively enough cavalry, considering that they were Central European people, etc. But no, Celtic cavalry actually had a very low military average, and just very few tribes were kind of considered better than the others, but also in there that they didn't have enough collective training, because it really gets to collective training if you want to measure the quality. The rest is kind of virtually influent. The same goes for this Germanic cavalry. This was kind of the broader equipment in there, and of course we're talking about the Scramasax as well. The Scramasax was, as we've seen, mostly a secondary weapon, naturally, but it could be very useful, and it had been developed especially during the migration era among these populations, because it was a very multi-purpose, multi-task, let's say, weapon. It could be used in so many ways. It was actually a pretty useful tool. Also, just think, I don't know, to cut certain, I don't know, to skin animals, to you could do a lot of things with a Scramasax, including slaughtering your enemies and drinking from their skulls, because that's what the Longobards did, by the way. Very gentle practice. And the so yeah, and naturally it could use in combat, definitely, but it wasn't really the main weapon you could rely on. That's essentially a large knife. It can be useful, but it's not really the best thing you can use. That's the reason why the average weapon was the spear and the spada, the long sword. I mean, relatively long sword. What I find particularly interesting is oh, and by the way, finishing about the armor, which we hadn't finished. Yeah, lamellar armor was definitely used, seemingly to the Longobard use, and we have a bit this stereotypical picture of the Longobard warrior just being equipped with this kind of lamellar armor. But this is not really all. I mean, the idea is the Longobards at this time could use every kind of armor. The problem is we have such a poor evidence, and surprisingly all these evidence, however, shows kind of lamellar armor. So that's the reason why we have this idea. But actually, especially from the second half of the 7th century onwards, when the Longobards were fully Catholic at this point and didn't bury their men with armor anymore, we basically stopped knowing what the hell they were using in battle. We have no iconographic evidence of valuable swords for at least specific evidence. So people like to stress, oh well, yeah, the Longobards kept using that kind of armor. No, probably the lamellar armor wasn't exclusive of the Longobards. Not even when they were at the height of their steps, their influence, let's say. They definitely, the early Germans used Celtic-derived armor like mail, and surely the Longobards kept using it. We have some fragment of mail actually for as a sort of aventail that was worn as a neck guard under the helm. This was used attached also to the lamellar armor, and this was common practice. So that's an example of mail that surely was used, but we don't have evidence of a coat of mail. But that was also surely used in part. There could be other form of armor, definitely, like the scale armor. It would have not been difficult. If you look at the rest of Europe at this point, it was plenty of all these kind of armor mixed. So the fact that for the Longobards we don't have direct evidence is not a proof that they didn't use other types of armor. However, lamellar armor tells us also that that lamellar armor is fundamentally used for stopping arrows most of the times. I mean, it's usually developed in contexts where arrow fire is pretty heavy. That's basically all the populations who made the use of it were practically from this steppes dimension. The steppes environment that saw a freaking high use of arrows. So this actually might be a hint that Longobards were had been coping with peoples who fought in that horse archer manner that had obliged them to partly adopt their tactics, or at least trying to imitate them, and then also keeping themselves for in a way that could cope with that. And that's pretty much it. We don't have any other evidence. Let's say that when the Longobards were conquered by the Carolingians at the end of the 8th century, people tend to say, oh well, the Longobards had that kind of lamellar armor and the Carolingians had the brunie, essentially that mail / plate armor fitting, this essentially was kind of a leather armor with buckles of metal into it, but there was also coat of mail, of course, as well. Well, no, as far as we know, by the 8th century, probably Longobards and Carolingians were equipped in a pretty similar fashion. There is no historical evidence of any kind to suggest that their armor substantially different were substantially different at that point. And the Carolingians won over the Longobards for reasons that have nothing to do with their equipment. Telling the truth. So let's remove these technological prejudices and so on. The Longobard equipment in this section is reaffirmed as indirectly, I mean without archaeological evidence, but by historical evidence, documentary evidence, by the laws of recruitment of Aistulf. That was that is actually one of the Longobard kings who fought against the Carolingians at the end of the kingdom. He was a pretty warlike, he was a great military commander as well, but nevertheless he lost to the Carolingians, which is not very surprising, but who basically reinforced certain recruitment laws into... I mean, the recruitment law it had always existed, but they had not been written down up to that late 8th century, because it was so usual that they were so usual that they had not been written down into the Edict of Rotary. And what we have is essentially, let me see if I can find this. Can find. There were different types of recruitment, but the most important thing here is that we have a segmentation of the Longobard army on the basis of those recruitment laws. These recruitment laws were based on the individual asset. So the first class was basically heavy cavalry. It was armored cavalry, and it was made up by those possessors who had those owners who had at least 7 case massarie. This is how they're called in Latin. Basically, there would be farms of some dimension, and also in here are not really extensionally distinguishable, but they probably had to do with the with the value of an equivalent value. And this had also to bring other horses, and even in addition to the personal equipment, also the exceeding one for a sort of for other people who could eventually fight alongside with them. There was a sort of light cavalry who was made up of who had at least 40 ujara of land, and then next to this there were at that point in Longobard history so-called the minores homines, so practically lesser men that had, if they had a shield, they also had to provide a quiver, bow, and arrows. And this is important because at this point in Longobard history, it seems like if the particular adoption of bow as the principal weapon of foot fighters, basically this means that cavalry was definitely the most important part of the army. Also simply because a infantry armed with bow and arrows can operate only with the backing of a force of cavalrymen, if there is no other infantry, definitely. So these laws might let us suggest that somehow that force of freemen that was relatively well off at the beginning of Longobard history had definitely declined. Also, this doesn't really answer us whether infantry had really declined as such, because we can't solve the initial problem that how many people really fought on foot, especially among the freemen, because that's the really important thing. We have seen that these large bodies of troops of bowmen, of foot bowmen, had always been there. Now the problem is that it seems that in Longobard society, many freemen at the time of the 8th century had impoverished, and at the point they could only have a shield and quiver to bring to war. But still the proportions are not really clearly distinguishable. Overall, in the amount of the however, it's still evident that cavalry was considered the most important part of the army. We don't know also in here whether it was so also at the beginning, whether this is something that came from the progressive social stratification into Italy. That is not a factor to be overlooked, because this is essentially what was happening to the Frankish world as well. To the Frankish world at the end of the 8th century, that there is this rise of cavalry and the progressive impoverishment of freemen, so that infantry was not much of a thing, at least in most contexts also in there. So, and this is particularly interesting given that the Franks initially had been definitely not famous for their cavalry, and still in the 8th century the Franks recognized that peoples like the Longobards and the Visigoths had this kind of place of honor in terms of as cavalrymen because of their past. So confrontating the Frankish and the Longobard situation at the end of the 8th century, you can't really tell whether the Longobards at that point had always a kind of a cavalry-based army or not. Essentially, it might as well be, in my opinion, that by the 6th century actually the Longobards had also solidly strong infantry, as is suggested by the Strategicon, or at least that, however, most of the Longobards could also fight on foot in a pretty effective way, whereas this decline in the 8th century, it's as if there had been a decline at that point, a social, economical decline of those freemen in the 8th century, which is kind of more sense than saying, that the Longobards were always a horse-riding people, because where cavalry had been the only important thing, because evidence even tells us that they fought as infantrymen, that they also had this cohesion that was disrupted on broken ground, that was harming for the unity of their formation of spearmen. So that's my general trend in my opinion, which is that ever since the beginning the Longobards had even during the same migration era, had a strong infantry, like all the Germanic populations, and that just eventually with sanitarization, it's really the majority of the people stopped being warriors since they started being farmers and having another life, and losing this, making the Longobard army losing this solid bulk of good infantrymen that existed before. Because if you look at other Germanic populations during the migration era, you realize the Germans objectively had very strong infantry in many ways. I mean, even given that lack of discipline and collective training, Germanic infantry charges were were considered quite dangerous by the Romans. In fact, in the same Byzantine manuals, it's explicitly said that if you can, do not meet them in open ground, because implicitly that's where they can do best as a collective charge. We know that the Alemanni infantry, that the Alemanni were also quite similar to the Longobards because they were Germans of the Elbe, and in fact southern modern dialects today would be Swabia today, but it was Alemannia, are very similar linguistically to the ancient Longobard, and now is an extinct language, but we know more or less what it was like. Well, the Alemanni were quite good at infantry, and their charges were definitely something the Romans took very seriously. Also because the Germans had taken the habit to do a bit like the Romans, like throwing their Angens before the charge, or throwing axes and so on to disrupt the enemy front line, then shouting and charging all together en masse, and that was pretty tough to bear, and usually just the Roman infantry was enough disciplined and trained to cope with such charges, for which, however, they also in the late antique times, the Romans had increased their missile power to kind of disrupt the enemy charges before they actually arrived in front of against the line. The Romans had actually increased towards late antique time their offensive/defensive capabilities of the army, partly because they also had made their army kind of lighter, also in equipment. This is very complex. We definitely have to discuss the late Roman army sometimes, because there is so many prejudices attached to it, including the fact that it was allegedly worse than the early imperial one. Completely false, if you're a bit of a spoiler. Where things otherwise release, just repeating like a parrot what other people tell, and has not really looked into the sources. But aside from this, let's say that do not underestimate Germanic infantry, because it might have been ill-disciplined, it might have been difficult to control, but actually all the sources stress that when these guys charged, it was better if you were not around. Basically, if you were not, unless you were a trained Roman and disciplined Roman legionnaire. So it's very interesting, in my opinion, because really for the migration era proper, we have a very scarce evidence of how these troops really fought, but we have so many hints that tell us, according to me, that gave us back a pretty clear picture, in my opinion. And according to me, just like the steppes influence on these peoples has been probably overemphasized from an ethical point of view, in my opinion, that is reflected also in warfare. Of course, these guys were brilliant cavalrymen, but nevertheless, most of them would still fight on foot, and Germanic infantry has always remained kind of the bulk of Germanic armies. So even at the highest of the migration era and the nomadic influence that came from the steppes, this is my interpretation. And in fact, the rise of cavalry proper, in the High Middle Ages, actually happens for reasons that have not to do with these ethnical influences, but it's mostly a structural dynamic related to society, politics and society, that has to do chiefly with the rise of feudalism. I remember when discussing with my tutor back in the day why on the Highstulf's recruitment laws, I was suggesting basically that Longobard society was evolving in a similar fashion, and the Carolingian one was, like with this impoverishment of the average freeman and the rise of an elite that was fighting on horseback. Now, my tutor said, well, this is not true, because what the Carolingians were doing was completely different. And I agree with her, but nevertheless, I think the trend was pretty similar. It was a general trend that happened in all the Germanic populations that settled down, and that was this kind of gentrification for which they weren't fighting anymore as they had been used to do. because the place where they had settled down were better. They didn't need to fight to survive. They needed just to work the land, for instance. So I understand what my tutor was stressing, the Carolingians were doing something completely different, yes. And the main difference, in fact, however, is it's that the amount of wealth that the average Carolingian nobleman had compared to all the other peoples in Europe, that basically transformed him into a professional war machine, while all the other peoples had basically a much weaker structure in this sense. I mean, in fact, the average Carolingian nobleman had even more land than the Longobard king himself. I mean, the Longobard king's private possessions, which means that Carolingian guy, that Frankish guy, could train all of his life for war, because there were other people working for him. He could recruit retinues. Longobard world wasn't anything like that. Longobard world had the highest per capita wealth in the world at the time. Italy had at that point. And which means that these guys were incredibly wealthy for war standards individually into Italy, but however still not enough in absolute terms to afford a full military equipment and to fight and to train all their lives as military men. So that's really the great difference, is that the Longobards, the Carolingians were developing a type of army that was unknown in Europe. A prepaid military class that fought all their lives, year after year, campaign after campaign, on the back of this peasantry. That, in fact, in Gaul was much less prosperous than in Italy at that point. So this brought the Franks basically to expand over other populations, to defeat peoples like the Longobards even, that were in the essentials not so different from them, but however lacking this professional elite. And that's really the point, because you can imagine that by the 8th century the average Longobard fighter was not in outlook different from the average Frankish fighter. Even in terms of equipment, probably, those who went to fight that were equipped in the same fashion. The problem is that these other populations didn't have the same level of collective training of the Franks. Where do you find in Europe by the end of the 8th century a military class like the Carolingian one, of horsemen, of armored horsemen who fight every single year of their lives in one or several campaigns and make a living out of the craft of war continuously, being served by that huge amount of peasants and serfs and so on? You don't find it everywhere. There was no place like that in the world, and that's why the Carolingians made it to crush so many peoples at once. There would be so many other anecdotes, so that the Carolingians actually got defeated sometimes also by these lighter, think about the Battle of Zuntel, or the Roncesvalles. There is seemingly also a battle on the Livenca River in northeastern Italy that nobody really know what happened. We only know here because there are two sources. One says that the Carolingians won, and another that the Longobards won. Moral of the story is that even if you take that the Carolingians won, Charlemagne gave, after the battle, a very large autonomy to the northeastern Longobard dukes. So this actually speaks for a kind of a military quality that, especially in certain areas of the Longobard kingdom, had survived intact in many ways. Sure is, however, that was probably due to the rise of mounted combat in those years. So really, about Longobard infantry, we don't know this excessive much in all ages. We can just basically we have especially the Strategicon is probably the best source, because if you don't have that, you don't have any clear evidence of the Longobards fighting with solid, compact fronts of troops. And the question whether these were kind of more or less cavalry-oriented peoples would be much more difficult to answer. The Strategicon, in my opinion, is quite eloquent, It fits more in general with the broader picture of the Germans mostly being infantry based at that time in history, and yeah, and the rest of the developments in Italy really suggest that Longobards, were undergoing a transformation. It was practically similar to all the other Germanic populations at that point. So yeah, that's more or less how I interpret the thing. I've spent several time looking at these aspects, and I think they're kind of cool. There is one aspect that might be interesting, although it's not strictly referred to infantry as well. It's about the appearance of the Longobard warriors. The Longobards were, in this cauldron of the migration era, one of the problems that you may be want to you may wonder is how did these guys recognize each other, especially in a moment in history where ethnicities were blending so much. There were so many different troops of different ethnicities on a battlefield. Well, there was a kind of a identity. Usually, the Germans had they distinguished themselves just like other populations on the base of their haircut. The Longobards, as sons of Odin, usually let their beards grow, because that was a character that was attributed to Odin, as we've said. So that was their recognition thing. But there were other peoples who were using beards, so actually they also let their hair grow in front of their face. This is interesting because it's a legend that dates back to the very origin of Longobard history, that is dispersed in the mists of myth, let's say. But it's nevertheless very interesting because basically it's the story of when the Longobards came from Scandinavia into the island of Rügen, seemingly, and they met the Vandals there. So basically the Vandals came. The Longobards were not still named as Longobards; they were called Vinili, as we were saying before, and they met the Vandals. And Vandals told them, look, if you want to pass through this place, you have to pay a tribute to us, which equated basically to lose their freedom and to be incorporated into Vandal people. So the Longobards say nuts, basically. And that's why there's all the story that the Longobards had come to Rügen with two male leaders, to Ibor and Ayo, if I'm not wrong. Those were two princes that actually stresses the fact that in the legend that these guys were, the Longobards came from multiple groups, so they weren't just one people. So the mother of these two guys also represents the Sippe, let's say. So the more agricultural and therefore female-oriented Scandinavian world, that this idea of the male wandering warrior is something that the Germans developed more when they were on the continent and when we were in Scandinavia in the origin. So this mother, here you see that women recur into Longobard history. The mother represented kind of as a woman the contact with the divine. The Longobards believed, like majority of the Germans, that the women had this kind of greater sensitivity that made them understand certain things men couldn't, that were coming from the gods, essentially. And so in here it's a beautiful story because the mother of the two Longobard princes calls for Freya. No, Freya is not Freya, really. It seems it's another minor deity, probably related to her, that is, however, represents the fertility, another fertility goddess, a female figure. And Freya basically represents the mother herd in some way. I mean, the mother of whatever it was, because we don't really know what Freya was at that point. But it really represented that Sippe, that sedentary world, the female oriented world, which intercedes in front of Woden. Basically, Freya goes to Woden, and Woden is sleeping in his bed, and oh wait, I missed one point. Actually, Freya basically, speaks to the mother of the two. The mother names was Gambara, if I'm not wrong. And Freya told Gambara, "Look, okay, I'll think about it. Just tell your men, your people, divinely, to go facing, I think, east. I mean, in towards the east, men and women with their even with women having their face on their with their hair on their face. I mean, now I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember whether they were called or not. However, basically the Longobards gathered all together, even with women, with their hair in front of their faces, as if they looked like bears. So men already wore bears seemingly at the time, so they kind of looked pretty homogeneous. So Freya goes to Woden, who is sleeping, and turns his bed towards the direction of the Longobards. And Woden wakes up and says, "Who are those Longbeards?" And Freya told him, "Now, as you gave them the name, now just give them victory." And in fact, Woden gives victory to the Longobards against the Vandals that had issued them to battle, because it was the day after, basically, the day after, the day before the battle, basically. So this happened at dawn, just the dawn before the battle. So it's this climatic moment in which the Longobards receive actually Woden blessing that they're actually adopted by Woden, which names them, because he looks at them and watches these guys, even women with the hair on their face, and says, "What are those long beards?" Because even women looked like as if they had beards in front of their face because of their hair. And so he names them. So he appropriates them. And this is very important because Woden has this pervasive force that seizes them and sees the warrior and makes him fight. And this myth is very important because from that point onwards, the Longobards were called Longobards, not Vinili anymore. Secondly, this myth is also very important because it's a myth of people. Because all the people here are called the Longobards. There is no king, you see here. That's very interesting. It's all the people together, even women. It's really their stock, their tribe, their identity that matters. And that's why what the Longobards maintained till the very end. And that's from that moment onwards that the Longobards basically let their hair and beard grow in front of their faces, although they had the back of their heads and their nape completely shaved. Yes, that was the outlook of the Longobards. Paul the Deacon, if I'm not wrong, states that still in the 7th century, at the time of Theodolin, that he could see himself at the Palace of Pavia, the paintings that the Queen Theodolinda had made realize inside the palace, that depicted the Longobards with that haircut, still in the 7th century. So we are sure that at least by the 7th century, the Longobards ideally still had this haircut to be distinguished by the others. Although by that time the Longobards were really mixing with the local population, so this need was kind of finishing in some way. But that was a pretty easy way to recognize an enemy. Another characteristic, it seems, was more of a uniform, like in concept, was this white-legged hacks. So there would be this leg gear around their white, around their tibia, essentially their shins. This is important because, at just a glance you could see whether that guy was wearing that white over his shins, so you could recognize him. That was useful in battle. You can imagine how that, there were no uniforms in the Germanic world, so that was the only thing you sometimes, together with the hairstyle, you could recognize an enemy. Maybe just some color on the shields or on the tunics, but the banners as well, but not so much. And these white-legged hacks are so are so important as a definition because basically the Longobards were mocked and ridiculed because of them. Why? At least there is an episode in Paul the Deacon that narrates that when Albavin, the king that eventually led the Longobards in Italy, had defeated the Gepids, or better, in battle, yeah, he had basically killed the Gepid prince, the son of the Gepid king, into battle. And Germanic custom was that now the Gepids were not very well off, and however is that if you killed someone's son, this someone could adopt you as an adoptive son. This was important because it was a kind of a direct recognition that you had been able to defeat, hopefully in a loyal way, a valuable soldier. So you had the valuable warrior, and you had the right of kind of substituting to that person. This is important in many ways. I mean, it might be kind of incomprehensible for us, but at the time it was very important because these chiefs, these individuals, were quite important for the unity of society. So even when one was killed, it was deemed that only the warrior who had managed to beat this valuable warrior could be worthy of substituting him. So basically, Albavin and his guard were invited by the Gepids at the royal palace. Let's say palace. You can imagine what in 6th century Hungary or Romania, palaces could really be. But yeah, they had them really. It seems that it was actually a thing. Especially the one that the Longobards also built on their own. The word is actually all in wood and maybe just a little bit in stone. Not much of a. And at that point, I think it was the brother of the slaughtered Gepid prince that looked at the. Obviously, he hated the Longobards because they had killed his son, his brother. Sorry, and the king actually was older and wiser. So according to the Germanic tradition, he was respectful towards his hosts, and he treated them properly, even if Albavin had killed his son. So sadly enough, in fact, when Albavin sat at the chair of the slaughtered prince, the father told him, that place was so dear to me, and you have essentially killed my son. And the other Gepid prince, the one who had his brother killed, ridiculed the Longobards because he told him, look at your white legs, you look like mares. And this seemingly, and we will see now why, it was an enormous insult because obviously, well, that's evident. You're a mare, you're a female, so it was stressing the fact you were just a sissy practically. And Albavin answered something like, well, I hope you have seen, now I'm paraphrasing, but he told him something, you have had the chance to see how these mares can kick the scattered bones of your warriors on the battlefield. And at that point, basically, the Gepids put their hands at their swords, and the Longobards too. And the situation was saved basically only by the wise Gepid king who said, okay, let's stop this, let's not be jerks, and they're right, they defeated us, so let's not, they're our hosts, we have to respect them. Now, this is interesting because people said, but, why is that the Gepids, I mean, historically speaking, why is that the Gepids were telling the Longobards that that they looked like mares? What's really the point? Is it because mares have white shins, or is that the reason? Because the term in Latin in Paul Deacon's history is "Fetile sunt aeque quas similatis." So basically, the the point here is that there have been several interpretations. From one side, people said, okay, at that time, if you look at the political situation, the Longobards were actually allies of the Romans. I mean, they were Roman federati. At that point, the Longobards had served among the Byzantines, and so maybe the Japanese said, okay, you're basically allied with the Romans, so you're kind of betraying your Germanic identity. The Germans at that time believed that essentially they were the best, the manliest, the most virile people on earth, essentially because they were true warriors. This was the thing of the Germans, that they consider themselves the best warriors and therefore the best men. So the Roman troops used sometimes the so-called tibialia, that were this kind of footwear that maybe said, I don't know, maybe the Longobards were wearing this kind of clothes just like the Romans because they had fought in the Roman army, that maybe they had brought this kind of clothes with them, this footwear with them, but there is no evidence of this. Seemingly, instead, what the good explanation that is is that basically the fetila, that actually appears in the text as this footwear, it would be nothing but the trammel. Essentially, this string that is used to block the posterior legs of the mares, basically to prevent them running away, and basically to be forcibly humped by stallions. So this is actually more fitting, and interestingly enough, this thing of the mares humped by stallion is a very frequent insult in the Senna. That is a Northman poetic genre that therefore makes us believe that basically that was really the point, that by wearing this white gear footwear, the Longobards looked like mares, that and therefore the fetile that were being this footwear was equated to was nothing but the trammel of mares that get humped by stallions. So that was the kind of insult that you have to imagine the German meetings like being completely poisoned in venom, in hate, and some of the greatest mortality ever in the Germanic world was during dinners, during feasts and banquets. People got assassinated so easily. People also drinking, getting high in some way. So this was actually the interpretation, and this was seemingly, in fact, mean of recognition of the Longobard warrior on the field. So I can't think of much else for now. The video is already pretty long. I'm sorry if I digressed now. This thing of the fetile, I didn't know how to tell it properly, but yeah. So I stop here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I wish you I don't remember how I said for now. I don't remember. For now, I wish you a nice time, and